What if death didn't just take you, it showed you something you weren't meant to see? What if in the final moments, you were forced to face a horrifying truth about the world and yourself that changed everything? Meet James Harris, a man whose life was turned upside down after a near-death experience. But the truth he uncovered on the other side may be darker than anything he could have imagined. James Harris was an ordinary man, living an ordinary life in the heart of Manchester. At 39, he had a steady job as a high school teacher, a nice home, and a loving wife. He didn't believe in anything supernatural, let alone the idea of an afterlife. Death to him was just the end, no grand mystery, no higher meaning, just silence. That was until the night his heart stopped. It began like any other evening. James had just finished his last class of the day and was driving home, exhausted from the stresses of teaching. The roads were slick with rain, and the night had fallen quickly, the streetlights casting long shadows across the wet pavement. He barely noticed the oncoming car speeding toward him, its headlights cutting through the downpour like a blade. The crash was brutal. James never saw it coming. The world spun violently, and then nothing. A suffocating darkness swallowed him whole. His body was still. His heart had stopped. For what felt like an eternity, James was weightless, floating in a void that seemed to stretch on forever. His senses were muted, no sound, no feeling, only an endless, oppressive blackness that seemed to press in from all sides. Then a light, dim, flickering, like the last embers of a dying fire. He tried to move toward it, but it felt as if something was holding him back. The darkness around him pulsed like it was alive, closing in on him. And then a voice, low, guttural, and dripping with malice. The voice wasn't human. It echoed in his mind as if it came from the very air itself. James tried to speak, but his mouth didn't move. His body felt frozen in place. The light grew brighter, and James finally saw where it was coming from. A door, old and weathered, standing alone in the middle of the dark void. It seemed to pulse with energy, as if something, or someone, was on the other side. And then he heard it again. Something in his gut twisted with fear. Was this death? The end? He didn't know, but it felt wrong. The door creaked open slowly, revealing a narrow hallway. It was unlike anything he had ever seen. The walls were black, slick with something he couldn't quite make out, and the air smelled thick, like rotting earth. The hallway stretched far into the distance, disappearing into a cold, impenetrable fog. "No," James whispered, his mind screaming to escape, but he couldn't move. He was trapped. The voice spoke again, closer this time. "You've seen it now. You've seen the truth." Suddenly, the darkness shifted. A figure stepped out from the shadows, its shape a blur at first, but slowly coming into focus. It was tall, too tall. Its limbs seemed to stretch unnaturally, bending in ways that defied human anatomy. The face was a shadow, but James could feel its eyes burning into him. And then the figure reached out a hand. "This is where the living and the dead meet," it whispered, its voice both soothing and terrifying at the same time. "You have walked too far." Before James could react, the air around him grew cold, suffocating. The world began to shift violently, the hallway twisting and contorting like a living creature, as if the very space was alive. His body jerked forward, pulled by an invisible force, and he was dragged down the hallway at a breakneck pace. The walls seemed to close in on him, the air growing thick and oppressive. With every step, the temperature dropped, and he felt an overwhelming sense of dread that clawed at his mind. He was no longer alone. As he was pulled further, he saw them. Figures, people, trapped in the walls. Their faces distorted in silent screams, their hands pressed against the stone as if they were begging to be freed. James felt a cold hand brush against his shoulder, and he spun around to see another figure, this one more familiar. It was his sister, Emily, but she was different. Her face was pale, her eyes wide and hollow, her mouth frozen in a silent scream. Her hand stretched out to him, but there was nothing he could do. She was stuck, trapped in this nightmare. "Help me," she whispered, her voice a raspy echo. James tried to reach for her, but his hand passed through hers as if she were nothing more than smoke. A cold laugh echoed from the shadows and the tall figure appeared again, its form even more monstrous than before. "You're too late," it said, its voice now a guttural growl. "They're all lost. You are lost." The walls seemed to close in, the ground beneath him shifting. James fell, crashing to the floor with a sickening thud. When he opened his eyes, he was back. He was in the car, the wreckage surrounding him. His heart was pounding in his chest. He could feel the rain pouring through the shattered windshield. His breath came in ragged gasps. He was alive, but something had changed. He could still feel it, the presence, the pull of the darkness. He could still hear the voice in his mind echoing through his thoughts. He tried to scream, to call out for help, but his voice was gone. The figure had marked him, and it was coming for him. Was James's experience just a hallucination caused by trauma? Or did he glimpse something far darker, something that waits for all of us beyond the veil of death? Thousands of others have reported similar encounters, visions of a place where the living and the dead intertwine. But what if those who cross into this world never truly escape? One thing is certain, death may not be the end. It may just be the beginning of something far worse.